Hey there, and welcome to Artificial Fluency. I'm John.
And I'm Emma. Great to be with you today.
Today, we're diving into a topic that many of our advanced learners have been asking for: how to take your English conversation skills to that next level. Beyond just being able to communicate effectively to really sounding natural and sophisticated in your speech.
Exactly. There's this threshold in language learning where you can express yourself clearly and understand most things, but you still don't quite sound like a native speaker. That's what we want to help with today.
We'll be covering 3 key aspects of advanced conversation skills: sophisticated vocabulary choices, mastering those tricky phrasal verbs, and fine-tuning your pronunciation for more natural speech.
And throughout the episode, we'll be demonstrating these concepts in natural conversation, so you can hear them in context rather than just as isolated examples.
Right? Because that's how we actually learn language best, through hearing it used naturally. So let's get started with sophisticated vocabulary choices.
So John, when we talk about sophisticated vocabulary, we're not just talking about using big fancy words to sound smart, right?
Definitely not. In fact, that could often backfire and make your speech sound unnatural or pretentious. What we're really talking about is having a range of precise and nuanced options to express exactly what you mean.
It's about having those perfect words at your fingertips that capture precisely what you want to convey, the words that make native speakers say. Yes, that's exactly it.
Let's demonstrate with some examples. Instead of saying something is very good, which is perfectly correct but basic, you might describe a meal as exquisite, a view as breathtaking, a novel as compelling, or a friend as reliable.
Right, and instead of saying you're very tired, you might say you're exhausted, drained, worn out, or even running on fumes if it's been a particularly long day.
Those are great examples of how specific vocabulary choices add nuance and precision. Let's try a quick back-and-forth conversation using some of these more precise vocabulary choices. I'll start.
How was that new restaurant you tried last weekend? The Italian place downtown?
It was absolutely phenomenal. The ambience was really charming. They've decorated it to feel like a cozy trattoria in Florence. And the pasta was homemade, which made a substantial difference in the quality.
That sounds delightful. I've been craving authentic Italian food lately. Was it crowded? I'm somewhat reluctant to go to new places when they're packed with people.
It was bustling, but not overwhelming. We went around 7:30, which seemed to be ideal timing. By 8:30, there was a considerable line forming outside. I'd recommend making a reservation if you're planning to check it out.
I appreciate the tip. I'm quite particular about noise levels when dining out. I find it frustrating when I can't hear my companions over the din of a restaurant.
That's a valid concern. The acoustics were surprisingly good, though. They've installed these discrete sound-absorbing panels on the ceiling that make a remarkable difference. You can have a conversation without raising your voice, even when the place is full.
So in that short conversation, we used words like phenomenal, ambience, charming, substantial, delightful, authentic, reluctant, bustling, overwhelming, considerable, particular, frustrating, din, acoustics, discreet, and remarkable.
These are all words that advanced English speakers would use naturally in conversation. They're not overly academic or uncommon, but they're more precise and expressive than basic vocabulary.
Another aspect of sophisticated vocabulary is understanding connotations, the implied meanings or emotions associated with words, beyond their literal definitions.
That's such an important point. For example, thin, slim, slender, skinny, and gaunt all describe someone who doesn't weigh much, but they have very different connotations. Slender and slim are generally positive, skinny can be negative, and gaunt suggests an unhealthy thinness.
Exactly. Or think about how curious, nosy, and intrusive all describe someone who wants to know information, but with completely different judgments attached.
One effective way to build this type of nuanced vocabulary is to start collecting near synonyms, words that are close in meaning but have different shades or intensities.
Right, like instead of just learning the word happy, you might explore content. Pleased, delighted, thrilled, ecstatic, and blissful, each expressing a different degree or type of happiness.
And it's not just about memorizing lists. It's about noticing these words in context, in podcasts like this one, in shows you watch, books you read, or conversations you have with native speakers.
Exactly. Pay attention to which words native speakers choose in different contexts. You might notice that furious is stronger than angry, or that starving is more casual than famished.
Another strategy is to start replacing some of your most commonly used adjectives, like good, bad, nice, interesting, or difficult, with more specific alternatives when you speak.
And don't be afraid to ask native speakers, is there a better word for what I'm trying to say? Most people are happy to help with vocabulary refinement.
The goal isn't to eliminate those basic words entirely. Even native speakers use good and nice all the time. But having alternatives ready gives your speech more color and precision.
Let's move on to our next topic, phrasal verbs, which are another hallmark of advanced, natural-sounding English.
Phrasal verbs are those combinations of a verb plus a particle, usually a preposition or adverb that create a meaning different from the individual words. They're extremely common in everyday English.
And they're often a pain point for even advanced English learners because they can seem idiomatic and unpredictable. Plus, there are so many of them.
Exactly. Even when learners understand phrasal verbs passively, they often avoid using them actively, opting for more formal single-word verbs instead.
Which is understandable but can make your English sound overly formal or textbook-like. Native speakers use phrasal verbs constantly in conversation.
Let's look at some examples of how phrasal verbs make speech sound more natural. Instead of saying, "I'll investigate the problem," in casual conversation, a native speaker might say, "I'll look into the problem."
Or rather than "I postponed the meeting," you might hear "I put off the meeting" or "I pushed back the meeting."
And instead of tolerate, you might hear put up with, as in, "I can't put up with this noise anymore."
One challenging aspect of phrasal verbs is that many of them have multiple meanings depending on context. Take pick up, for example, fall.
Right. Pick up can mean to lift something, to collect someone, to learn something new, to acquire something like a language or a habit, to improve.
And then there's the issue of separable versus inseparable phrasal verbs, which affects word order. Some phrasal verbs can be separated by their object, while others can't. Let's demonstrate that. With pick up, as in lift, you can say either pick up the book or pick the book up. Both are correct. But with put up with, you can't separate the parts. You'd say put up with the noise, not put the noise up with.
It gets even trickier with pronouns. With separable phrasal verbs, if the object is a pronoun, it must go between the verb and the particle. So it's pick it up, not pick up it.
Let's try incorporating some common phrasal verbs in a natural conversation to show how native speakers use them. I'll start. Hey John, did you end up going to that networking event last night?
I did, but I almost backed out at the last minute. I was feeling really tired after work, but I figured I should show up since I'd already RSVP'd.
I'm glad you went through with it. Did you run into anyone interesting?
Actually, yes. I bumped into my old colleague Sarah, who I'd lost touch with years ago. Turns out she's setting up her own consulting business now. We really hit it off again and decided to meet up for coffee next week to catch up properly.
That's great. It's funny how those events can work out sometimes. I've been putting off going to networking things lately. I always feel like I need to come up with clever things to say.
I know what you mean. I usually start off feeling awkward, but once I warm up to people, it gets easier. Last night, I ran out of business cards though, which was a bit embarrassing.
Oh no, well, I'm sure you can follow up with an email instead. Speaking of which, I need to get around to reaching out to those contacts from the conference last month.
Don't bring that up. I still haven't gone through all those business cards I collected. I keep meaning to, but something always comes up.
So in that short conversation, we used phrasal verbs like end up, back out, show up, go through with, run into, bump into, lose touch, set up, hit it off, meet up, catch up, put off, come up with, warm up to, run out of, follow up, get around to, reach out, bring up, and go through.
That's a lot of phrasal verbs in just a brief exchange. And that's how natural conversation works. Native speakers don't even think about it, but they're using phrasal verbs constantly.
What I recommend for mastering phrasal verbs is to focus on the most common ones first, especially those using high-frequency base verbs like get, put, take, make, go, and come.
For instance, learning the various phrasal verbs with get up, get over, get along, get away with, get back to, get into, and so on, gives you a lot of conversational mileage.
Another approach is to learn phrasal verbs in thematic groups. For example, you might focus on phrasal verbs related to relationships, grow apart, break up, get along, fall out, etc., or business, set up, start up, close down, take over, etc.
And as with advanced vocabulary, the key is to notice phrasal verbs in context rather than just memorizing lists. Pay attention to which particles go with which verbs, whether they're separable, and the different meanings they can have.
Try to consciously incorporate a few new phrasal verbs into your speech each week. It might feel awkward at first, but with practice, they'll become second nature.
Now let's move on to our final topic, pronunciation refinements for advanced speakers.
When we talk about advanced pronunciation, we're not necessarily focusing on pronouncing individual sounds correctly, though that's important too. We're talking about elements that give your speech a natural, native-like flow.
Right at this level, it's usually not about whether you're saying a particular word correctly, but about the overall musicality of your speech, things like stress, rhythm, intonation, and connected speech.
Let's start with word and sentence stress. English is a stress-timed language, which means stressed syllables occur at regular intervals, and unstressed syllables are compressed to maintain that rhythm.
This is different from many languages that are syllable-timed, where each syllable gets roughly equal emphasis and time. That's why English can sound quite irregular if you're coming from a syllable-timed language.
To demonstrate, listen to how I say this sentence with proper stress. I was thinking of going to the movie this evening.
Notice how Emma emphasized the words thinking, going, movie, and evening, while compressing the less important words like I, was, of, to, and the.
If I were to give equal weight to each syllable, it would sound more like this. I was thinking of going to the movie this evening. It's technically correct, but the rhythm sounds off to native ears.
This stress pattern applies at the word level too. Take a word like photographer. The stress is on the second syllable, photographer, not photographer, or fo-2-graph-a.
Stress patterns become even more important with word pairs that have the same spelling but different meanings based on which syllable is stressed. Like record, record as a noun, record as a verb, or present, present as a noun or adjective, present as a verb.
Another crucial aspect of natural-sounding speech is connected speech, how words flow together in conversation rather than being pronounced as separate units.
This includes phenomena like linking, where the final sound of one word connects to the initial sound of the next word. For example, turn off might sound more like turn off in fast speech.
Then there's elision, where sounds disappear in connected speech. Want to becomes wanna, going to becomes gonna, and I don't know might be I to know.
And assimilation, where sounds change to become more like neighboring sounds. 10 bikes might sound more like 10 bikes because the in changes to M before the B sound.
These connected speech patterns are what give English its natural flow, but they can make listening comprehension challenging for learners who are used to hearing words pronounced distinctly.
Let's demonstrate with a natural conversation using these features. Listen for word stress, sentence rhythm, and connected speech. What did you end up doing last weekend? I thought you were going to visit your brother.
I was supposed to, but his kids came down with that flu that's been going around. So instead, I just hung out at home and caught up on some reading I'd been putting off.
That's too bad about your brother's family. Are they feeling any better now?
Yeah, they're on the mend. We're planning to reschedule for next month, probably around the 15th or 16th.
Sounds good. What were you reading, by the way? Anything interesting?
I finally got around to that book you recommended ages ago. You know, the one about the history of technology? It's actually a lot more fascinating than I expected. I couldn't put it down.
Oh, I'm so glad you liked it. The part about the early internet developments was eye-opening, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I had no idea how much of what we take for granted now was basically created by a handful of people just messing around and experimenting.
If you listen carefully to that exchange, you probably notice things like what'd instead of what did, gonna instead of going to, as a quick filler, and how multisyllable words like fascinating, developments, and experimenting had clear stress patterns.
You also might have noticed how the most important content words received more emphasis, while function words like articles and prepositions were reduced and connected to surrounding words.
So how can you work on these aspects of pronunciation? One effective technique is called shadowing, listening to native speakers and repeating what they say, trying to match not just the words but the rhythm, stress, and intonation patterns.
Podcasts like this one are great for shadowing practice. You can pause after short segments and try to repeat exactly what you heard, mimicking the natural speech patterns.
Another approach is to record yourself speaking and compare it to native speakers. This helps you identify differences in your rhythm, stress, or connected speech patterns.
Hey John, did you end up going to that networking event last night?
Technology can help too. There are apps designed specifically for pronunciation practice that provide feedback on your speech and highlight areas for improvement.
Remember that the goal isn't necessarily to eliminate your accent completely. Accents are part of your identity, and many native speakers have regional accents too. The aim is to make your speech clear and natural sounding, with appropriate rhythm and stress.
Exactly. It's about being easily understood and sounding natural rather than trying to pass as a native speaker.
So we've covered quite a lot today. Sophisticated vocabulary choices, mastering phrasal verbs, and refining your pronunciation for more natural-sounding speech.
These 3 areas, vocabulary, phrasal verbs, and pronunciation, work together to elevate your spoken English from simply correct to truly fluent and natural.
Let's summarize some key takeaways. For vocabulary development, focus on precision and nuance rather than complexity. Collect near synonyms that express subtle differences in meaning or intensity.
For phrasal verbs, start with those built on common base verbs like get, put, take, etc. Learn them in context rather than as isolated lists, and pay attention to whether they're separable or inseparable.
And for pronunciation, work on the musicality of your speech, stress patterns, rhythm, and connected speech features. Shadowing native speakers is one of the most effective techniques for internalizing these patterns. Remember that becoming advanced in these areas takes time and consistent practice. Don't get discouraged if progress seems slow. Even small improvements add up over time.
Try to be an active, attentive listener when you hear native speakers conversing. Notice the vocabulary choices they make, the phrasal verbs they use naturally, and the flow of their speech.
And most importantly, practice incorporating these elements into your own speech regularly. It might feel awkward or unnatural at first, but with time, they'll become second nature.
We hope this episode has given you some useful insights and practical strategies for taking your English conversation skills to that advanced level.
In future episodes, we'll dive deeper into each of these areas, exploring specific vocabulary fields, phrasal verb families, and pronunciation challenges in more detail.
Until then, keep practicing and remember the path to advanced fluency is a marathon, not a sprint. Consistent small steps will get you there.
Thanks for listening to Artificial Fluency. I'm John.
And I'm Emma. See you next time.